Christian Ethics here
I got my camera
at Howard University School of Divinity. We want to give you a little background on this lecture series. It began in the fall of 1985 as the Feminine and Religious Traditions Lecture. It was the brainchild of Dean Lawrence Jones, who was the Dean of the School of Divinity from 1975 to 1991. Dean Jones wanted the lecture to represent the Divinity School's commitment to raise the level of dialogue about women in ministry to the highest level of scholarship and research. And the inaugural lecture series was actually, we had 4 lecturers on 4 consecutive weeks. And this is ancient history, but 1985, I mean, that's 32 years ago. And we called it the Cheryl and Dolores Show, because your name had to be Cheryl or Dolores. Cheryl Townsend Gilts, Cheryl Sanders, Dolores Williams, and Dolores Carpenter. And so we had 4 consecutive weeks of lectures, the inaugural series. And then those lectures were published in the Journal of Religious Thought. And that turned out to be the top-selling volume of the JRT of all time, featuring those 4 lectures. And we did, at least in the early years, endeavor to publish the lectures in our journal so that we would have an ongoing repository of the best scholarship on women in ministry during those years, and women in religious studies. In 2009, the lecture was renamed the Nannie Helen Burroughs Lecture. And Nannie Helen Burroughs is one of our patron saints at the School of Divinity. She was born in 1879, and her reputation as an educator, as an orator, as an entrepreneur, as an activist, as a religious leader, created a legacy. During those early days of the lecture series, there was, and I don't know if it still exists, but there was a Nannie Helen Burroughs Club. And it was a group of church ladies who would come to the school at least once a year. And they were people who had been mentored and helped, and they had a certain allegiance to the legacy of Nannie Helen Burroughs. I'm not sure if those ladies are still around, but we certainly do endeavor to keep the legacy and the memory and the activism, the mindset of Nannie Helen Burroughs alive through our lecture series, which we have it in March as also a part of our celebration of Women's History Month. Our Nannie Helen Burroughs lecturer this year is Dr. Angela D. Sims. She is the Robert B. and Kathleen Rogers Chair in Church and Society and Academic Dean at St. Paul's School of Theology in Overland Park, Kansas. She holds a doctorate in Christian social ethics from Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia, where she studied under the tutelage of Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon. And prior to her matriculation at Union, she completed a baccalaureate degree summa cum laude at Trinity Washington University and a Master of Divinity with honors here at this Howard University School of Divinity. Dr. Sims' research examines connections between faith, race, and violence, with specific attention to historical and contemporary ethical implications of lynching and a culture of lynching in the United States. She's a principal investigator for an oral history project, Remembering Lynching, Strategies of Resistance and Visions of Justice. And her research has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the Womanist Scholars Program at the ITC Interdenominational Theological Center, the Louisville Institute, the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning in Theology and Religion, and the Institute for Oral History at Baylor University. Dr. Sims is the author of Lynched, The Power of Memory in a Culture of Terror, published by Baylor University Press in 2016. Ethical Complications of Lynching, Ida B. Wells' Interrogation of American Terror, co-edited with Dr. Cannon and Dr. Emily Towns of Womanist Theological Ethics, a reader, and she's the lead author of Religio-Political Narratives in the United States from Martin Luther King Jr. through Jeremiah Wright. Her book, Lynched, The Power of Memory and a Culture of Terror, we ordered the book and it didn't exactly arrive in time, but what I'm going to ask is if the books come sometime between now and when she has to leave tomorrow morning, I will have her autograph the books and then we will make them available for sale. But I'm very disappointed that we weren't able to get them here in time, but we will have some books available and hopefully we will be able to get signed copies for those of you who would like to have a copy of the book. And so at this time, with no further ado, as they say, I want to welcome to the podium Dr. Angela Sims, who will be addressing the topic, Curating Truth, Black Elders' Memories of Lynching Culture as an Embodied Ethic of Veracity. Dr. Sims.
Be able to come home. And so I would like to thank Dean Pollard, and there are a number of individuals in this room who were faculty members when I was a student here, who shaped me. And so Dr. Sanders, Dr. Newhart, Dr. Bellis, thank you. I continue to benefit from having studied with you. I'm also thankful for all my classmates who made it out, for family and for friends, and for this place that's called Howard University School of Divinity. This is a special place, and my hope is that individuals who matriculate through these halls will recognize what a gift it is to be able to study with individuals who are deeply committed to the work of graduate theological education. I begin with two basic assumptions. The first assumption is that some of you already know that my research examines ethical theological implications of lynching. And the other assumption is that some are also aware that I devoted almost 2 years to document the oral histories of Black elders' memory of a culture that lent itself to such barbaric practices. What might be less obvious is my assertion that elders who entrusted an aspect of their memory about lynching and a culture of lynching with me represent Black prophetic practices. Each contributor has a story to tell about life in the United States that disrupts a carefully crafted version of truth, particularly a national narrative of equality premised on a myth that everyone is in pursuit of an ambiguous dream. Even if unconsciously aware of an association of power and rhetoric, oral history participants use language symbolically to describe their understanding of self in relation to others. Their reflections convey an understanding of human dynamics that stand in tension with a basic Christian tenet that all people are created in God's image. Thus, to give voice to dimensions of race as a polarizing religious factor necessitates a re-examination of a universal concept of the Imago Dei. Despite verbal declarations of love of God and all humanity, socio-historical evidence suggests that encounters by Blacks with proponents of lynching and a culture of lynching provide accurate depictions of individuals' relationship with the divine. This realization of an embodied theology that situates expressions of God in diverse sites of worship, from beyond the confines of a church house to the foot of a lynching tree, contradicts notions of a palatable testimony. When it comes to lynching and a culture of lynching, we must ask ourselves whose account, whose truth will we believe? It's important to be clear that there is no easy way to talk about lynching as a historical, contemporary dimension of life in this country. Black elders' recollection of lynching culture suggests that at its best, history is always an incomplete record. My research illustrates how oral histories, as primary texts invite and maybe even demand that religious scholars examine and assign value to these non-scribal sources as repositories from which to reframe theological questions that force an examination of key issues and ethical problems that may not be addressed from multiple perspectives in our accepted and often unquestioned canonical sources. After all, a memory of lynching, the act itself a form of domestic terror that functions as a metaphor to control human behavior, is consciously or not, for many Black elders, a life-defining moment. To come of age in varied shades of Blackness in the late 19th and early 20th century, and we might even say even now, in these early years of the 21st century, symbolized and continues to symbolize to many Blacks who remember lynching that truth must always be informed by an analysis of this nation's complicated and tortured fascination with terror. Yet lynching and a culture of lynching in this country is a subject frequently associated with notions of culpability, self-reproach, remorsefulness, and humiliating disgrace, with conversations rarely designed to incorporate narratives of Blacks, particularly persons who do not have national name recognition, as a means by which to broaden this nation's historical record. While many may recognize and applaud Mrs. Mamie Till Mobley's courageous act in 1955 to have an open casket at her teenage son's funeral, and in so doing, challenge the world to grapple with lessons of the hour, there is still a reluctance by some Black elders to talk about lynching. It is possible to contribute this silence to the fact that some Blacks are unable to determine what might be accomplished in sharing their memories of such horrific events. For example, Ms. Clara Jeffries declined in an interview with journalist Leonard Pitts, Jr. to describe a lynching she witnessed in 1930. According to Pitts, Jeffries questioned, and I quote, "Why bring it up? It's not helping anything. People don't want to hear it," close quote. Other Blacks, like senior relatives of a friend whom I contacted before I launched the oral history project that informs Lynched, the Power of Memory in a Culture of Terror, feign any knowledge of lynching activity, even though they themselves resided nearly 7 decades in North Carolina. I am not baffled when Black elders choose not to talk about lynching. Though much can be gained from their historical recollection, their silence reminds me that I cannot ignore the fact that residual effects of lynching and a culture of lynching have to be taken seriously. Because of lingering, though often unacknowledged residual effects, lynching memories, like slave narratives, offer a different lens through which to evaluate personal and communal values. As such, dialogues on and about lynching cannot and should not be ignored. Participants in my oral history project who resided in various sectors of the United States add depth to existing historical, sociological, and theological contributions on this difficult topic. Retired educators, clergy, scientists, veterans, entrepreneurs, lawyers, and day laborers discuss lynching because for them, historical remembrance is a theological, ethical mandate. So whether they acquire the equivalent of a first-grade education or achieve the highest degree in their field, lynching narratives, when viewed as oral epistles, challenge us to reassess notions of courage and the sacred. From recollections of aborted lynchings and strategies of survival, Blacks who remember lynching invite me to consider how their stories, shaped and still unfolded in the shadow of lynching trees, influence what constitutes truth. Although blood, or the threat of blood, is etched forever in the recesses of the minds of many Blacks who came of age in the United States during a period marked by lynching, their socio-historical recollections can function as points of entry. Entry points to provide the human community another frame of reference from which to examine diverse ways in which notions of civility frame narratives that offer insights about Black elders' conscious decision to go into their interior archives and to determine for themselves if or how they will give voice to a truth that reflects their lived reality. Long before the horrific events that occurred in the United States on September 11, 2001, and a growing realization of the import of a law and order mandate associated with results of a national election on November 9, 2016, most Blacks with at least 7 decades of life experience have vivid memories, even if intentionally repressed, of domestic terror. These select comments from oral histories about Black elders' experiences with lynching culture confirm that persons were, and I quote, executed for any little thing. They saw, but they could not speak. You don't ever want to be caught in the woods after dark. Always had to be careful where we go and what we say. It was always a fear of white people that was instilled into us as children. It's like a horror story that humanity can inflict such a thing upon humanity. You knew that people were lynched, but you didn't know a name of a person. You could pick up the Negro press and you could read about a lynching almost every week that was taking place somewhere in the South, close quote. While I will never know fully the effect of lynching, oral historical accounts can function as a basis from which to evaluate strategies of resistance and visions of justice from which to construct an ethic of veracity. As I weigh benefits associated with an excavation of truths embedded and embodied in the minds and souls and bodies of Black people, it is imperative for me to acknowledge that courage, and here I do a play on this word, I think about courage as civility in our age. That this notion is connected intricately to notions of justice as persons look back to times past and reflect on current situations as a mirror by which to assess how truth-telling might inform a national response to hate-infused rhetoric and actions employed to perpetuate a culture of fear. A review of remembering lynching participants' vivid responses to culturally embedded and present-day responses to terror suggests, to borrow from Frederick Douglass's 1894 speech, there are lessons of the hour that continue to merit serious consideration. Of particular concern for many oral history participants is how a lack of knowledge of United States history by a large percentage of a post-1960 civil rights generation, particularly its Black citizens, contributes to a reenactment of a culture of lynching with persons ill-equipped to assess the import of cries to make America great again, premised on a notion of exceptionalism couched in simplistic religious jargon. Embedded in this nationalist-like language is a disavowal of human rights that at its most fundamental level is predicated upon a perpetuation of mythological notions of privilege that often prohibit a forging of alliances across class lines. After all, some persons are so steeped in a false sense of racial entitlement, they choose to participate willingly in perpetuating stereotypical myths rather than engage in difficult but necessary dialogues from which actions to further a more just society might emerge. I contend that it is virtually impossible to think about the contributions of Black elders whose oral histories inform notions of courageous truth-telling without also recognizing that they, like their contemporaries who elected not to verbalize their experiences with and about lynching, probably recognize a correlation between memory extraction and training in detecting and diffusing improvised explosive devices. It is this knowledge of imminent danger that will more than likely inform an internal assessment from which persons who live with a historical reality that contradicts notions of human civility determine whether or how their truth-telling may further the common good. In this regard, courage is not an abstract trait. Rather, courage is a contextualized response informed by an understanding of self that seeks to actualize a prophetic mandate to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the divine. Thus, courage is a reasoned decision neither to advance a conspiracy of silence to promote miseducation, nor to condone racial hatred. Quite the contrary, courage is a virtue that demands that we acknowledge that truth, a way of knowing that is intricately connected to our existential reality, when given voice and space, can have far-reaching consequences. Courage that calculates cost associated with danger and imagines creative, safe, and liberating movements. Where the memories of lynching and a culture of lynching are preserved for future generations. Come on in. So where the memories of lynching and a culture of lynching are preserved for future generations is contingent, however, on a number of factors. For some Blacks, documenting these narratives is indeed, as I mentioned earlier, an ethical mandate. Yet to ascribe normative status to this position devalues conscious decisions to remain silent, not as an act of cowardice or historical complicity, but rather as an act of agency to preserve one's own sense of well-being. As a non-participant in Sumter, South Carolina mentioned, consideration must be given to possible repercussions of speaking out. After all, as this gentleman suggested, to talk is also to live with possible consequences associated with sharing memories which could result in confronting a non-law-abiding past that is fraught with ambiguity and sentencing disparities. On the other hand, as one contributor stated, and I quote, "When I talk about it now and I think about it, I really have a lot of anxiety about that," close quote. I cannot ignore these concerns associated with sharing memories. To do so would be tantamount to inviting Blacks who remember lynching to step on a landmine. As retired Oakland Public School educator Leola Arnold suggested, persons may choose not to vocalize their memories of lynching, and I quote, because they may think that it will stir up something and cause some of the problems that we're having right now. Because every so often when people bring up various things that's happening now, they'll say, we don't want those days to come back. And maybe they think it might stir up some of the things that happened then. And people feel that it happened then, but it's not going to happen again, and that way of doing, maybe that's it. Close quote. It's possible that one could make a good argument to support reasons why persons choose not to remember the hurt, to choose not, and I quote, to remember the hurt you felt, the pain, close quote. Though Pastor Clarence Kidd of Benton, Louisiana, elected to share his memories of lynching culture, he also noted that he would prefer not, and I quote, to even think about that. When I do now, I get angry. Something like that happening. It hurts me deep on the inside to even think about it. Your fear, your anger. I don't want to think about it, that sort of thing happening all over again. And let me do a little discursive moment. When I visited with Pastor Benton and several members of his CME church in Benton, Louisiana, they took me on a field trip. I got in a minivan with them and we retraced the steps, the route that I had just come in. On my drive in, I marveled at the beauty of the place that I passed. On the field trip, they talked about this human-made body of water that hid lynching trees. And so it's caused me to think about sites that are no longer visible, but that are deeply embedded on the minds of individuals who grew up in a time when they had to pass these sites on an almost daily basis. So whether individuals share their memories of lynching or not, each, through a process of internal assessment, signals that courage and truth are not abstract ideas. Neither are these moral virtues grounded in notions of absolutism. Rather, remembering lynching narratives compel me to reflect upon lynching, and here I borrow from Emily M. Towns, to reflect upon lynching as a legitimate cultural production of domestic terror. Given this historical reality, courage and truth cannot be comprehended fully without a further explication of the role and function of symbols, tools used strategically to intimidate and restrict activity. From persons who engage in thick interior explorations, I glean additional insights about processes employed to recall traumatic events in such a manner that they do no harm to themselves or to others. Also, when the very act of lynching and its primary weapon, the noose, are internalized to ensure a silencing of history, Blacks who came of age during this death-dealing era offer insights into moral discernment that afford me another point of reference from which to examine the impact of sustaining invisible wounds. It is also not surprising that I continue to gain a greater appreciation for persons whose lived experiences are antithetical to historical revisionary accounts proposed by some elected officials and educators. When employed as primary resources, these oral histories are further evidence that regardless of religious orientation, there are strategies of resistance and visions of justice that emerge from a culture designed to thwart a sense of human dignity that is of immense significance in a global capitalist society. Life in the shadow of the noose is fraught with ambiguous tension. On the one hand, it is a reality complicated by traditions and compounded by a desire to give voice to practices that reflect the worst of human nature. On the other hand, this state of existence seeks to honor that which contributes to the well-being of all, to be co-participants in God's unfolding community. As they recall personal accounts and, quote, stories that history books don't talk about, close quote, Blacks who remember lynching share life-preserving insights on ways in which they navigated landmines designed to infuse them with hatred. This astute awareness allowed many not to succumb to built-up hate, characterized by some as a process of personal healing that resulted in them being able, and I quote, to put that hate down, close quote. Over time, they chose to engage in a de-internalization process that enabled them to name lynching as a byproduct of racism, which is nothing more than systemic sin, cloaked in language that is used adroitly to manipulate a desired response. For Blacks who lived through and now live with memories of a culture characterized by lynching, to remember is to give voice in their own words about a time when they, and I quote, lived in America, the land of the free, but yet there was not freedom. There was a fear. That was the way they did things. The threat was great. You never knew when or where. Everyone talked in hushed tones about it. It was just something that happened, close quote. From persons who remember today just like it was yesterday, we receive nuggets of wisdom that call into questions notions of a beloved community that are compromised when privilege in its various manifestations condones behavior by individuals who are, and I quote, not bound by any of the rules that went on there, close quote. In these narratives, accounts of courage embodied by people who, for example, though still Black in a small white town, compelled me to become a more informed citizen. Otherwise, I risk being ill-prepared to identify and navigate camouflaged, improvised explosive devices designed, for instance, as economic policies, school choice proposals, and immigration directives that seek to disrupt my mental, emotional, cultural constructions which shape an understanding of that which is ultimately just. Even if trees no longer bear strange fruit, a proliferation of stand-your-ground legislation in multiple states and racial disparities within the United States incarceration system suggests that Blacks remain in the shadow of the lynching tree. Individually and collectively, there's a moral responsibility to respond in an informed manner if injustice is to be named and confronted wherever it surfaces. Very much aware of a growing movement to erode human rights in the United States of America, Reverend Wallace Hartsfield Sr., pastor emeritus of Metropolitan Missionary Baptist Church in Kansas City, Missouri, insists that Christians must confront the horrific symbolism associated with the cultural practice of domestic terrorism that was often sanctioned, enforced, and executed by governmental officials if the church is to move from a place of accommodation to a place of prophetic agency in an increasingly globalized world. For Hartsfield and countless others, a silent church is a complicit church. In its refusal to be a voice that proclaims consistently a word of truth, the church chooses for various reasons to condone injustice. In a world where slavery masquerades as human trafficking, and lynching is disguised as self-defense laws which allow armed persons who believe they are in imminent danger to use deadly force, a historically and socially conscious church must engage in courageous truth-telling. Because of this, conversations about lynching are not designed to foster popularity. Rather, these conversations are strategic opportunities to provide relevant information about cultural symbols and their embedded meanings. Even though symbols most commonly associated with lynching, the rope and bundled sticks that fueled human bonfires, are not displayed visibly, the church is called to remember that lynching functioned and continues to function as a metaphor to elicit a desired reaction. When the church embraces and embodies its prophetic mandate to speak life, it does so fully aware that risks always accompany a decision to confront systems of injustice. In communities across this country, individuals born in or prior to 1928 have a specific account of and about lynching that needs to be preserved. Some will remember persons whom they knew who died at the hands of unknown persons. Others who survived and avoided lynching may reveal unlikely persons who assisted and aided in their rescue. There are others who will talk about lynching trees in their respective communities and discuss techniques they employed so as not to become paralyzed by the fear of the unknown yet possible. With rare exceptions, Blacks who remember lynching offer remarkable insights about a human capacity to forgive without forgetting, to survive and even thrive in the midst of unimaginable evil. When Black elders talk about lynching, they convey a powerful message that illustrates their adroitness to navigate within a country that is simultaneously home and alien. When Black people testify about an experience of exile in a nation that self-promotes as the epitome of democracy, they signal to countless generations, now and to come, that Christians have a moral responsibility to learn how to sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land, where increasingly Black life is expendable. This is a reality that graduate theological institutions in a post-11/9 society must address. Agility and adaptability is essential if we are to develop, implement, and assess the relevancy of our curricula to address moral problems with which our students and graduates grapple daily. As we individually and collectively purpose to embody that which is ultimately good and just, may we, like these bearers of history, never forget inhumane practices and strategies employed by many to counter that which for many Blacks depended on their ability to excavate philosophical truths embedded in their lived reality that informed a life-affirming interpretation of their sacred texts from which they sought to fashion traditions in the shadow of lynching trees that may one day enable all of us to divest ourselves of oppressive behaviors. If lynching narratives, like slave narratives, when told from the perspective of Blacks, provide another aspect about a shared existence in this country, the time to preserve these conversations is now. Given an almost constant reminder that there are some in high places who seek to normalize alternative facts. That is, when lying becomes a perceived virtue. Curating truths embedded in the memories of Black elders is an essential task that must be prioritized. We cannot afford to wait. Thank you.
I want to invite your questions. I'm so thankful that our lecturer has honored our time, and so we will have an opportunity. We already have heard the lecture, okay? So we don't need another lecture. But if you have a question or if you have a comment that is pertinent to what has already been said, we welcome the conversation because we have a lot to think about and a lot to respond to. Thank you so much, Dr. Sims, for an excellent presentation that's whet our appetite for the book, but also to open the door for our conversation. And so if you would come to the mic, I will let you field the questions, if there are any questions or responses that.
Well, before I field questions, I would like to acknowledge the presence of another professor who is instrumental in my formation, and that's Dr. Courtwright Davis. So thank you for being here.
My question is just what triggered your interest in the subject of lynching? you are now with writing in terms of writing a book and researching it?
It was a process. The year after I finished my MDiv, I spent a year in independent study with Dr. Sanders, Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, and Dr. Jean Rice, looking at three persons: Ida B. Wells, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Martin Luther King Jr. When I began my PhD studies, I found myself deeply immersed in Ida B. Wells. And my dissertation research looked at Wells's three-phase response to lynching: boycott, migrate, and write. And I looked at how to appropriate those three strategies by thinking about reorientation, reinterpretation, and reexamination. Months before I was scheduled to defend my dissertation, I had a conversation with Wallace Hartsfield Sr., who preached a chapel service at St. Paul School of Theology. And in response to a question that I posed to him, he told a story that he remembered. He shared an experience that he remembered growing up in Hazleton, Georgia. And while he never used the word lynching, what he described was the aftermath of lynching. A body being dragged through a black community, with his grandmother very quickly pulling the shades on the house, and people not wanting to talk about what had occurred, and being inquisitive and finally finding out what happened in his neighborhood. And as I listened to him, I said, if he remembers, are there others who remember, and would they share their stories with me? And that was the birth of the Oral History Project that has resulted in this publication.
Two questions. In your research, did you ever come across, there was something that was presented at the New York Historical Society talking about without sanctuary, it was
A photo exhibit.
right, so was there any cross-section there? Did you ever come across people who were able to tell any of, from those stories, or where that matched up? And then the second thing is, across the stories, depending on geographical areas, did it differ? Because I remember my grandmother telling me a story, she was from Arkansas, about how people tried to come into their community, cause mischief, and they didn't have it, like they shot the people up. So I'm curious to know if, depending on the nature of the community, how they allowed, or if they allowed this terror to exist, or how they fought back.
So first question, without sanctuary, no, I did not interview anyone whose families members were depicted in those very vicious photos. I did, however, when I was on sabbatical and spending time in Atlanta, meet students whose relatives had been lynched in Georgia. And there were newspaper accounts of those lynchings. It was their great-grandparents. As far as similarities across communities, speaking with individuals who were originally from Arkansas and having them share stories about parents putting a young teenage child on a freight train so that he would not be subjected to lynching because he dared to stand up for himself in a little town. Talking to another gentleman from Birmingham, Alabama, whose grandparents and parents at the time that he was growing up lived near Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and having white persons for whom his father was employed, notify and alert them that they could no longer keep the Klan from coming to get him, and this child being hidden and not being able to go back until after he was an adult into this community. Having others from a town in Oklahoma, Sepulveda, Oklahoma, not too far from Tulsa, talk about the way in which they didn't understand the significance of the lynching field in that particular town. I did not encounter any blacks who talked about relatives who used violence as a way. I did, however, in speaking with a now deceased woman who adoptive parents lived in St. Joseph, Missouri, talked very extensively about the way in which her family provided shelter for the relatives of an individual who had been lynched in St. Joseph, and they were fleeing for safety.
Thank you very much for your research. Follow-up question, and then kind of a shift. Follow-up question, did you collect any narratives from the north, from Lynching, Pennsylvania, and you got this whole narrative going across the southern tier of the state? And then the gear shift question would be, are there other areas are there other topics besides lynching that you can think of that the harvesting of elder memory would challenge current conventions?
The first question, I interviewed a gentleman who now lives in Prince William County, Virginia, but grew up in New Jersey. And he talks very vividly about lynching in New Jersey. Everyone else, I think, that I interviewed had migrated from the South to their various locations, but he was the only one who talked about lynching as it occurred in New Jersey. When I think about Black elders' memories, I'm thinking, first of all, about a group of public educators, many who spent half of their life teaching in a legally segregated system, and the other half of their life teaching in a quote-unquote desegregated systems, and the lessons that might be gleaned from them in their time of sharing. I also think about individuals, and I've been contacted by a gentleman whom I need to follow up with, individuals, Black individuals who were among the first to work as prison guards. And the lessons that we might glean from them. So those are two populations that readily come to mind, many of whom, being in that first generation, are quickly dying. And so how to identify, it's easier to identify, I think, some of the educators. I don't know how easy it might be able to identify the guards who worked in these prison industrial complexes, but I think that there might be a way to do that.
Thank you so much for your work and your sharing. I'm wondering whether you have had any contact with Brian Stevenson, a death penalty lawyer who is doing, I think, a lynching museum.
Yes, in Birmingham.
Yeah.
I have not been in touch with him, but through a connection with the Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta, I am hoping. The Episcopal Diocese of Atlanta is engaged in a 3-year project that's called Dismantling Racism, where they're actually doing work within their diocese to educate and heighten awareness around lynching. And then they do, I use the term loosely, a pilgrimage each year to a particular site. Stevenson was their lecturer last September, and I will be their lecturer this upcoming September. So I'm hoping to make those connections in that way.
I have a question. In your research, did you ever interview anyone who participated as a lyncher?
I did not, but Alex McCullough, who is an ethicist on faculty at Loyola, New Orleans, is doing that work. The work that I have done with Black elders, he is attempting to do with the children who are now in that 75, 80 age range, who were strategically placed around those lynching trees by their parents.
So they witnessed the lynching as children.
I had a student at St. Paul from Texas who thought it was okay to bring me a souvenir from his family, and I declined and suggested he needed to do some work with his family.
But he did, he had a body part.
Dr.
Dr.
Harrison,
Simmons.
good to see you.
Good
Been
to
a long
see you,
time
Dr.
since Wabash.
Yes, good to see you. I'm wondering, so I have some of my students in requirement, actually, but I have some of my students from history of the Black church, and I'm wondering how you might contextualize so some of the historical realities from slavery. You labeled it as domestic terrorism, and our work is so familiar, and you know that, connected. But I wonder how you might contextualize for them the historical realities of domestic terrorism, i.e. your work in lynching, to what we are experiencing as Black people now, violence against Black males. Now, if you covered that in some way, then I apologize.
I just touched on it, but
Okay.
here I would say is that the violence was never just targeted at Black males.
Mhm.
The violence was always targeted at Black bodies. And so while we may not have as many historical accounts about Black women who were lynched through rope, and we know that there were Black women who were brutally beat to death by the lash. We also recognize that when we think about lynching, particularly in the early Reconstruction era, that for some, things came down to papers. This whole notion that Black bodies are always subjected to having to justify presence and being fully human and fully citizen simultaneously. And so when I think about the connections between our work with slavery and lynching and now this contemporary era, we only have to remember that any given day, even if we ourselves in 2017 have a passport, the legality of that document can be questioned at any time. That is no different than the papers that people had to carry from one place to the other. And so thinking about the way in which the past is so intricately woven into the present, really it challenges us to know history. And it certainly challenges us to know Black history and Black church history. So when I think about the hush harbors, I often wonder how the hush harbor informs the way we think about contemporary sanctuary movements, and how the Underground Railroad causes us to think about Black participation in sanctuary movements, and to think about the ways in which our lives intersect that of our red, brown, and yellow sisters and brothers. There will be a trail of tears. And so what do we glean? Because many of us have a shared African and indigenous heritage. What is it that we glean from these shared legacies that will allow us to respond to what's unfolding before us now?
As a student in Dr. Harris's class, she had an opportunity to share pictures of lynching, and in the class you can it's almost like the picture emit emotion of my own colleagues, and I'm wondering, as you travel in your research, perhaps in the South, and speak with individuals who learn more about these practices, what kind of emotion does it emit actually?
I'm going to respond to your question this way. I entered into my field work very naively. I began my field work in Prince William County, Virginia. And the morning that I was scheduled to have my first interview, one of my colleagues sent me a text. And the text said, "I am praying for you as you begin this process." And I said, okay, fine. But 30 minutes into that first interview, I realized that if I was going to get through this field work, that I would have to do something that was counterintuitive. And that was, I would have to set aside my own sense of being fully present and go into almost a clinical type mode to get through the process. It took me, so after I did 2 years worth of interviews, I spent a summer at Baylor University listening to the interviews and proofing the transcripts. And I still had to do that very, very detached because I could feel the anger boiling up in me. I then took another 2 years to just let the work sit until I was able to enter into it and to bring my questions to the work. I needed to be certain that, recognizing my own biases and my own point of entry, that I didn't speak into what was not being shared by the individuals whose oral histories I was using.
Dr. Simmons, thank you so much. And I'm sitting here also trying to hold in the emotions. Just how did you, though, then with the people who you were interviewing, when their emotions were, brought to the surface?
So the interviews were framed on one end. I did biographical conversation. Who are you? Who were your people? Da, da, da. Then there was the lynching piece, and then there was the transition piece. And often the transition would result in me walking around their homes looking at photos with them to bring us back to a point. Because I recognize that I am not skilled as a pastoral theologian, I am not skilled as a counselor, and I could not leave people open. Thank you.
I appreciate the comment that you made about the role of the church. And so in our hyper-praise churches these days, how are they going to foster the legacy or the memory of the lynchings?
Let me suggest that for those of us who are perhaps affiliated with or know individuals who are affiliated with what you describe as hyper-praise churches, that we have a moral responsibility to educate and to make aware, even if it means that we engage in conversations about what's occurring right here in our own nation. If we fail to do that, we have failed to perhaps prepare people to respond in appropriate ways when they realize that things are exactly as people are professing that they will be.
I want to ask you, in terms of a rough estimate, the number of chronicled, in terms of your research, how many lynchings actually, in the time periods, I don't know what time period you were focusing on, but the number of lynchings actually happened either within the South or throughout.
So I'm not going to give you an exact number, but if you go back and you look at the stats, Ivy Wells has stats from 1892 to about 1910, 1920. If you look at the work that's archived at Tuskegee, lots of data there. Arthur Raper has a book that also lists those lynchings, and all of these three sources draw on newspaper accounts. So we know that the data is incomplete, but they're drawing on newspaper accounts to record what they are able to record. I'm gonna go here, and then I'll come back.
I go straight to the money because I'm the money person. How much is your book? And when will it be available?
Dr. Newhart, how much is the book? Is it?
I don't know that I have,
I think it's
You don't
$25.
get a discounted price. The books that I ordered, we at a discount.
where is the word?
If it was your permission. No, the books, if you get it from me, it's $20.
I'll give you the $20
My question was, in the interview process, did anyone speak to how communities or how families were able to deal with their trauma or kind of rebuild? And I'm asking, like, in follow-up with this question of, like, connecting history with current event, and I guess trying to get some advice on how we will currently deal with the trauma and rebuild.
So keep it in mind that 84 persons with whom I spoke and the generation that they came up in, with the exception of one, all self-identified as Christian. All talked about the way in which they grew in their faith. And others talked about the way in which they depended upon community. And so being able to respond in a timely manner to minimize the harm that would come. So yeah, their faith, joy in the community. And the other thing that I picked up on is that for those who said they didn't know about lynching specifically, you listen closely, they talk about the strategies that their parents use as a way to safeguard them. And so hearing things in hushed tones became a way for parents to also ensure that their children in some way were safeguarded. But now, there's also something problematic about the hushed tones, because it means that some were ill prepared because they didn't understand. They lived in very closed communities, and when they left those communities, were not prepared for what was beyond the confines of those communities.
I just wanted to follow that question, if I could. Did you collect any funeral programs or have anybody talk about the rituals? When you started your question, that's where I was going. How does the community deal with it? One way we deal with death in communities is by funeral rituals, and whether or not the person, okay, this person has been lynched, and so do you continue that sort of coded language by saying, oh, well, the Lord called him home?
I did not do that, but Randall Bailey, Dr. Randall Bailey from ITC has been encouraging me to do that.
Well, I want to encourage you to do that.
So, in your conversation with the elders, I keep thinking about the impact that it had on the Black families. So, in your conversations, how were you able to uncover some of the dynamics that affected the Black family, whether that be between husband and wife, wife to husband, children, grandchildren, up until the present day?
Active listening. I would ask an open-ended question, and I would let them talk. I would scribble notes. If I needed to deviate from my script, to go back and ask for clarity, or to ask them to expand upon what they said.
I wanted to ask what's the expected end for the lynching discussions, and who and how are you going to approach organizing discussions on lynchings? That's one. The second part was kind of piggybacking on what Eric said was, do you feel as though the result or backlash or effects of lynching are affecting this lost generation of, I guess, teenagers now,
So when you
today?
say expected ends,
Like,
explain.
what are we going to get out of the conversations or the discussions? What result, what, is it closure? Are we trying to move on past the effects of lynching by having discussions about lynchings?
So it's 2017, right? And folks are still being killed by police officers, even in states where they are licensed with the individuals who have been killed. In one case, was licensed to carry a concealed weapon. In another case, where you've got a child who is perceived to be a threat, who was killed. Another, where you have a man in Walmart. We could go on and on with the examples of men, women, and children. So lynching culture is still very present with us. It's neo-lynching. So you don't have the rope and the bundle of sticks, but you still have the same effect. The question becomes, how do we raise awareness in such a way that individuals vote in a manner that moves us towards at least acknowledging the way in which we have allowed certain practices to continue under the sanction of government law and order. The conversations are designed to perhaps save lives, to make people more aware, more engaged. The conversations are also designed to demythologize the way we think about who is subjected to law and order and who is not. The conversations are also designed to help us think a little bit more intentional about the religious language that we use and what we mean when we use certain theological terms.
My question actually dovetails, I have a question and comment dovetail with yours very neatly because I had two queries. One is, what was the most recent lynching data, story, information that you have? And I would distinguish that from the neo-lynching, although that may be a false distinction. But I remember either reading, or I remember getting some information that shocked me about how recently lynchings have transpired. So that's number one. And then number two, with regard to the closure issue, and I think this is part of what Brian Stevenson is going for in the establishment of this museum, is that Desmond Tutu and the post-apartheid South African government established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the TRC, to unearth the crimes and terrorism that had happened among neighbors and people in community in an effort to heal. And so I wonder if there's an element of that in the work that you're doing.
So first, we can all remember Robert Byrd in Texas. He was lynched in the 20th century, early 21st century. I always have questions around these notions of truth and reconciliation. I don't think there can be any reconciliation without repentance. But if there were true reconciliation in South Africa, we wouldn't have neo forms of apartheid and ghettoization. So without the repentance, I don't know how we move towards reconciliation. I'm also always concerned that the onus of responsibility to move towards reconciliation is often borne by those who have been subjected to the terror. Dr. Davis?
Dr. Sims, I'm very pleased and proud to see you, and I'm sorry to be late. My wife and I just got back from New York on the afternoon bus, so please forgive me.
See Hamilton.
And I saw Hamilton. Yeah.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah. And saw the one shots.
Yes.
Yes. So I came in late for your lecture, and so I hope to hear more. But I picked up on a few things, portable things. Blacks remain in the shadow of the lynching tree, which I thought was a very important one. That America is still simultaneously home and alien. You said that. And then in your discussion just now, you spoke of violence always targeted towards black bodies rather than black men as such. So please forgive me for putting on my theological hat, because that's what they pay me for here. And I'm trying to pull it together. Clearly, we're dealing with cultural memory, and that's the basis of what your research has been about, right? But then we also deal with cultural metaphors. And the two metaphors that come to mind is a man called, what's the name of the black judge again in the Supreme Court?
Clarence Thomas.
Huh?
Clarence Thomas.
Yeah, Clarence Thomas.
That's what he was about to say.
When he was being interviewed, you know, he said, high-tech lynching, right? Here was his book, right? And then so that carried its way through until James Cone came out with his book, right? He spoke of the cross and the lynching tree. So here you have a Supreme Court judge, right? And a theologian speaking of that way. So the memory and the metaphors coming together, right? I begin to ask myself now, when will there be a kind of cultural metamorphosis, right? A changing over, because what we really need in this metamorphosis is a new set of myths. Now, not myths in terms of alternative facts or presidential lies or anything like that. Not talking that way. Real myths that pull us together
good.
so that we can get rid of the home minus alien kind of thing, right? Because a society has to live by myths that encourage us and push us forward. So that's my thinking. I'm not asking the question, I'm just trying to sound intelligent.
I'm trying to sound intelligent, I think you are.
Well, yeah, but listen to what you have said, what I picked up and conversation here now, right? These are the things that come together because the cultural memory is so important, and then the way in which the discourse, you spoke about the religious language, but the general political discourse, right, that picks up on lynching in so many different ways. We need some kind of metamorphosis because you can't continue like this. Good? The problem is that you cannot destroy a myth, or you should not destroy a myth, unless you have a better one to put in its place. And so the surge for cultural myths that can really lift us above the cultural memory, not that we're going to suppress them, but that we change them into something that is positive. And that's all I had to say.
Well, thank you for that, because what you point us towards is the whole notion that how does a country divest itself of its life? And recognizing that no one wants to easily give up power. How does power get reappropriated in ways that move us towards this metamorphosis that allows for a sort of an interconnection of these shared memories and these shared stories?
Given the African way of orality and art, did you discover any new songs or new images that were curated by Black people during your, or descendants of the Lynching culture? I am thinking particularly around something other than Strange Fruit, which was written by a white immigrant, a Jewish immigrant, but popularized by Billie Holiday and Nina Simone, and then later other white artists. And the images that we see around lynching were not taken by us. They were not our photograph or intellectual property. And so have you seen, or did you discover any other songs that were organic to our tongue and our telling of our story in paint, photographs, and other? I did.
To respond to that, there's certainly a body in African American poetry which compares lynching to crucifixion. I mean, Richard Wright's poem "Between the World and Me," which Coates took as the title of his book, that was a very rather gruesome depiction of a lynching, or the aftermath of Wright finding the aftermath of a lynching and his kind of going back in that. I remember on some occasion I was thinking about reading that poem aloud, and then I read it and I said, I don't think I want to do that. So there's this whole genre that I talk about in my book, Word and Soul, of African American poetry where the crucifixion of Jesus is compared to the lynching of African Americans.
And you understand my question really was to say
Anything else?
what was on the front porches.
Right. Dr. Moore? Thank you all.
Thank you. Dr. Sims is a favored and beloved daughter of the Howard Divinity School. We celebrated our centennial convocation a few months ago, And I wanted to give you a few mementos to take with you. I know nobody takes notes anymore, but it's a nice book. And I think we have a lanyard and some documents in there. But just a little, just a small token of our appreciation, because you are one of us, and we are very thankful and proud. We're going to buy your book, and we're going to follow you on Twitter and Facebook as you continue to ascend as a scholar, as an advocate, and as someone who is courageous and faithful to your vocation. Thank you. Thank you all. So much appreciate a really good conversation, and I know that you will want to, as I said, I did order the book that is arriving. I hope, I've been checking home to see, I haven't delivered to my house if they've come yet, but I will have those books available. If I don't have them, maybe I can make them available at the dean's office. But you can sign up tonight if you would like to get a book. And the price on Amazon, I think, is $29, but we were able to get them at a discount price of $20. So $20. If you want to get a book, see me tonight. And I see you have your money. And then we will make a way to get it to you. But hopefully, if it does come tonight, it'll come tomorrow. So before the end of the week, you should be able to get the book in your hands. And I'm just hoping that we'll get them in time so that she can sign them. But I can't promise that. We do have a reception that is in the space next door, and there is a class here in a few minutes, so I'm going to